In the name of the National Latino Behavioral Health Association and the National Hispanic and Latino Prevention Technology Transfer Center, we welcome you. Our center is happy to partner with the National American Indian and Alaskan Native Prevention Technology Transfer Center to bring you a 4-part virtual learning session titled Culture is Prevention. This is session 4, titled How We Can Culturally Navigate Between the Two Communities. My name is Dolca Michelle Zelaya, and I'm the program coordinator for the National Hispanic and Latino Prevention Technology Transfer Center. I will be your host for today, along with our colleague Cindy Sago from the National American Indian and Alaska Native Prevention Technology Transfer Center. Before we introduce our moderators and panelists, I will turn over to Dr. Rebecca Maldonado Moore to present us with an opening blessing. Dr. Rebecca Moore.
Father, Creator, grandfathers, we stand before you on this day that you've created to give you thanks. Thank you for the 4 directions, for the world beneath us and above us, for the center of your creation. Thank you for life in the water, life on the land, life in the air, life in the stars, and our relatives that have passed over. Thank you for breath, matter, and movement until we return to you. Please be with all of your children at this time, that our minds and hearts may be open to what we share with each other, and that we will be able to use some of this information in our work serving others. Metakio Oyastin.
Thank you, Dr. Rebecca Moore, for this beautiful blessing. Now, next slide. Now we have some brief instructions about today's session. The VLS will be recorded and archived for future playback. A copy of today's presentation will be also made available after the event. The lights will be muted throughout the presentation to minimize background noise. When we get to the Q&A portion of our session, you will have an opportunity to ask questions by clicking the Q&A box, and the moderator will present your question to our panelists. Next slide. Let's start by introducing the National Latino Behavioral Health Association. NALBA is a nonprofit located in New Mexico. The mission and goal of the National Latino Behavioral Health Association is to influence national behavioral health policy, eliminating disparities in funding and access to services, and improve the quality of services and treatment outcomes for the Latino population. NALBA Executive Director is Mr. Fred Sandoval. Now, allow me to introduce our Prevention Technology Transfer Center. Our PTTC are part of the network, the PTTC network, a multidisciplinary resource for professionals in the prevention field. The PTTC network was established by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. SAMHSA is comprised by 10 domestic regional centers, 2 national focus area centers, and a network coordinating office. Together, the network serves the 50 U.S. states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Pacific Island of Guam, America Samoa, Palau, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and the Mariana Islands. Here you're seeing the map of the US-based ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC. Our center has a national focus for Hispanic and Latino communities and the workforce that provides services to these communities. Our staff, our PTTC is staffed by Dr. Pierluigi Mancini, our project director, Priscilla Yamasi as the executive administrative assistant, and myself, Dolca Zelaya, as a project coordinator. Now it is time to introduce Cindy Sago and her team. Cindy, welcome, and thank you so much for collaborating with us.
Thank you very much, Dolca, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Cindy Sego, and I am the Program Coordinator for the National American Indian and Alaskan Native Prevention Technology Transfer Center. Our center aims to provide training and technical assistance services to substance abuse prevention field professionals, paraprofessionals, organizations, and others in the prevention field that are focused on American Indian and Alaska Native communities. Our activities and services are focused on developing and disseminating culturally appropriate tools and strategies. These tools and strategies are tools and strategies needed to improve the capacity of prevention specialists to deliver effective, culturally informed, evidence-based, knowledge-based practices with the intent of enhancing the quality of substance abuse prevention interventions, trainings, and prevention activities in our native communities. The members of our PTTC staff are Dr. Anne Holinskinstad, who is the program director. Our co-director is Sean Bear, who's a member of the Meskwaki tribe in Iowa, and I, Cindy Nanava Sego, the program coordinator and also a member of the Akan tribe from Ghana.
Thank you, Cindy. We also will be asking you to fill out a brief survey at the end of this event. This satisfaction evaluation is important to the work we do and provide us with the opportunity to improve our training efforts. Although we do not secure continuing education credits for this event, we plan to do for future events. A certificate of completion will be sent to you after these events. So let's begin. Now it's time to introduce Dr. Pierluigi Mancini. Is the project director for the National Hispanic and Latino Addiction Technology Transfer Center and the National Hispanic Latino Prevention Technology Transfer Center. Both centers are housed at the National Latino Behavioral Health Association, NALBA. With over 30 years of experience in culturally and linguistically appropriate behavioral health, treatment and prevention, Dr. Mancini is one of the most requested after national and international consultant and speaker of the subject of mental health and addiction. His area of expertise is immigrant behavioral health. Cindy?
Thank you, Dolka. And from our center, we have Dara Jefferson, who is the moderator for the National American Indian Alaska Native PTTC. She is a member of the Northern Arapaho and Meskwaki tribe here in Iowa. She's also a US veteran, and she currently serves with the Native Center for Behavioral Health here in Iowa as a graduate research assistant, where she's enrolled as a doctoral student at the University of Iowa College of Public Health. She has 11 years of experience working for tribal programs, with over 6 of these years as a domestic violence and sexual assault advocate for Native women, children, and their families. She continues to address violence in Indigenous communities and is dedicated to empowering others. Thank you very much, Dara, for joining us.
Thank you, Cindy. Dr. Mancini and Dara, welcome. We will continue please with the presentation.
Thank you so much, Dolka and Cindy, and welcome everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend the afternoon with us in our fourth and final virtual learning session about this topic, cultures prevention. It really is an honor to be here with you today and for us to be able to have this wonderful topic with two wonderful panelists and my co-host, Dara Jefferson. But let me begin by introducing our two panelists. Beginning with Dr. Rebecca Maldonado Moore. Dr. Moore received her Master of Social Work degree from the University of Utah with a community organization concentration. She was awarded her doctorate in 2002 from Cornell University's College of Human Ecology with a concentration in planning and evaluation, and minors in cultural anthropology and American Indian studies. She has more than 20 years of practice experience in community-based development and has been teaching graduate and undergraduate courses in accredited social work programs for more than 15 years. Her research interests include strategic planning and evaluation, cultural competency, diversity, equity and inclusion, interprofessional education, and community healthcare. These interests have contributed to her developing special interest courses in substance use treatment, community-based research, crisis intervention, and macro-level courses. Dr. Moore is Northern Arapaho Mexican American. Our second guest is Dr. Matt Ignacio. Dr. Ignacio is a tribal member of the Tohono O'odham Nation. His research is focused on improving the health and wellness of indigenous people and communities across the United States. Dr. Ignacio brings over 21 years of experience in the fields of HIV, STIs, harm reduction, and indigenous wellness, and is committed to strength-based approaches to social work education, practice, and research. Dr. Moore, Dr. Ignacio, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you here today, and I look forward to this wonderful discussion. Dara, it is a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today, and I look forward to your collaboration, and I wanted to give you a chance and an opportunity to say hello to everyone.
Hi, like Cindy mentioned, my name is Dara Jefferson. I am originally from the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. I currently live on the Meskwaki settlement here in Tama, Iowa, and I look forward to hearing our presenters.
Thank you so much, Dara. So we're going to start the same way that we've started this before. We'll let the presenters introduce themselves as they begin to answer the first question. So in the first question for both panelists, as you introduce yourselves, can you share with us your cultural background, including some examples of how you became aware of the intersection of both cultures in your life? And Dr. Moore, let's begin with you.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for being a panelist on this virtual learning webinar. It's an honor knowing that this has been in the works for a while and that there are so many people who have been logging in to listen to these conversations. Thank you to the American Indian, Alaskan Native, PTTC, and to NALBA. And as I prepared for this event, it really gave me an opportunity to reflect on the rich culture that I come from. As you know, I am an enrolled member of the Northern Arapaho tribe and Mexican America. And it's a total fluke that Dara Jefferson and I are both from the same tribe. We're both from Wind River, Wyoming, which is, you know, I'm impressed, Dara, that there are other people coming from my tribe who are also pursuing a PhD. My maternal parents, mother is really the one from Wind River, Wyoming. And my great-great-grandparents were the Spoon Hunters and the Lone Bears from the Mill Creek and 17 Mile Crossing areas. My great-great-grandparents on the maternal side were the Warrens and the Underwoods. So we have been able to maintain our family genealogy back 7 generations. And that was through oral history and then the collection of like birth and death records through the local Catholic churches. My paternal father's grandparents originated from Portugal and Spain during the 1700s. So their generation list also goes back 7 generations. So there's a long laundry list of begats. And it began with Jose Santiago and Maria Cayantana, all the way down to Francisco Maldonado and Nicolosa de Leon. My father would tell us that we are first generation Mexican Americans, but we have roots to Spain, Portugal, the Aztecan Confederacy, and knowing that I am indigenous to both continents, to North America and to Central America. That's why I believe I have such a rich history and background that I can't identify with only one nation or one group of people. And these multiple ethnicities have really contributed to my cultural orientation. And I make this disclaimer now that I don't represent all people, all Indian people. None of us can say that. But I can say that my experiences were shaped by the cultures that I have come from. I'm the product of these multiple ethnicities and cultural orientations. And believe it or not, I and my siblings were actually considered illegal during the 1950s because marriage between races was not legal. And that also filtered down to tribal groups, tribal councils, and how they counted or recognized relationships. I'm the product of forced relocation in the 1960s when economics and threats of termination impacted tribes and communities, all because of federal government relationships. And I'm also the product of the Indian Self-Determination Act, which was in the early 1970s that afforded me the opportunity to even dream of attending college. I've been blessed to have a mother who was very, very supportive of education, knowing that it was a means for a better life and for me to be independent. When I was living on the Wind River Reservation, my father and mother had made the decision to relocate so that we would have different opportunities and it wasn't just about employment. So my family were just one of thousands of other Indian people who migrated to urban areas across the country. And during this time, I can say that my parents attempted to instill their sets of cultural values in all of the children. My father was bilingual. My mother is trilingual, and she learned Spanish as a result of having a relationship with my father. She was a very, very intelligent woman. And having all of these different experiences, I've also been forced with multiple awakenings that most people probably haven't been challenged with because of my diverse background. And these awakenings have included challenges, growth, and a lot of resilience. I don't think I would be here now had it not been for some of those experiences I had as a young adult. And it hasn't always been easy, especially as a child. I had both urban and reservation experiences. I attended public school in Tucson on the other side of town where all the brown and the red people lived. And I spent summers in Wyoming because my grandmother insisted that we be home for the summers and that we stay connected to our very huge family of relatives. I know I was loved by my grandmother, but I was also misjudged or misunderstood by some of my Indian relatives because of who my father was. And one of my first awakenings was when I was told I couldn't speak Spanish at school and it was English only. So linguicide really was one of those threads that became a norm for many ethnic minorities during this time. It wasn't just, speaking native language in a boarding school. It was also not speaking your language, your home language in a public school setting. Another awakening I had was when I witnessed an extreme act of racism directed at my beloved grandmother. And this was by a white rancher in a border town. And that's an experience that, I just can't erase. So these adolescent awakenings actually showed me that there are differences among people of color, especially directed at or by white Americans who misjudge, misunderstand who we are as people. But I've also had a lot of blessings in my life because of my ancestry. And this includes knowing who my people are, what their cultural and spiritual values were, And this also includes Christian beliefs. This is not, we don't live in a society anymore where everything is static. Everything is actually very organic and fluid, and we adapt accordingly. So my parents wanted us to be proud of who we were from both cultures. And as I was listening to the last virtual learning seminar in this series, and listening to what Dr. Quintana and Dr. Cheo Torres were talking about, I found myself going through like this mental checklist of everything that I had also experienced as a child. Now, a blended cultures, right? And the traditional healings, how they promoted health and stability within our own family. My father believed in indigenous healing practices. Um, the curanderos from south of the border, as well as we had a local curandera who we visited on a regular basis throughout my childhood. With my mother, she turned to her mother and her grandmother for any kind of advice that we needed in terms of home remedies or cures or things that were going on with us. And later on in life, my mother really relied heavily on faith and prayer to deal with a lot of things that she couldn't control. And I want to say that spirituality is connected to healing, and healing is connected to spirituality. And both of my cultures believe that this is when in the treatment of common illnesses, and believing that there's a higher power, a greater power, a spirit world other than ourselves to help us address our mortal problems and issues. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. That is wonderful. Um, really appreciate the wonderful ability that you've had to expose yourself and your history in answering that question. I think that so much can be learned from our previous generations, and if everyone would take the time to do some of that work, I think that we really would learn so much more from each other. In part of my Italian heritage, we've been able to trace some of our history to the 1300s. And some of the people that we have found are very interesting characters. And of course, my family is very intertwined, goes from Italy, from Spain, from Colombia, South America, to the United States. So there's lots of different histories in there, and we've only really done a little bit of what could be done. We're trying to find Dr. Ignacio. We've seemed to have lost his connection.
He's having some technical difficulties, and I am going to text him the call-in link.
Okay, perfect. So we may have him by phone in just a moment. Because I would be very, very interested. I would love to hear his introduction as he, to the same question as he became aware to the intersection of both cultures in his life and the kind of history that he's had. So while he comes back, maybe we can just talk a little bit more about this same. In the same thread, if there was anything else that you wanted to add from your history or extrapolate on some of the items that you did mention while Dr. Ignacio comes back on the line.
I think that part of this conversation includes knowing who you are, definitely, but also recognizing that many ethnic populations in this country have gone through uh, an acculturation process, and that this acculturation has also influenced how we see the world. And it does not mean that everyone becomes totally assimilated, but it does mean that we have to internally reflect on who we've become as we have become a part of the citizenship of this country.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And Dr. Ignacio is back. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So Dr. Ignacio, can you share with us, as you introduce yourself, your cultural background, including some examples of how you became aware of the intersection of both cultures in your life, please?
Right. Well, thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Ignacio, and I'm a member of the Tahana Atam Nation. So if you don't know where our tribal ancestral lands are located, we are smack dab in the heart of the Sonoran Desert. And where ancestrally the villages that my parents are from, my mom is from a village just outside of Tucson, on the southwest side of Tucson. And my father is from a village closer to our sacred mountain, Waukiolek. And so there's an interesting story in that where we come from, because let's just take the city of Tucson, which actually was our traditional village and pronounced Chukshan. That's all ancestral land, right? Well, where we would gather salt traditionally is at the Gulf of Mexico. And that was a sacred pilgrimage young men would make as a ritual for manhood, would go down to the Gulf of Mexico and collect the salt and bring it back. And that was a ceremonial process. So you think of the land that spans all the way from what is now present day Tucson down to the Gulf of Mexico, that's all native land. That was all indigenous land. And even north from Tucson to Phoenix, all the way up through, think of Palm Springs, that's all the desert. And so it wasn't until modern times that there were lines drawn and that defined the state of Arizona. And those southern border lines cut right through our traditional ancestral lands. So how did I become aware of both communities of my own people and people in Mexico? Well, I also had growing up, in addition to growing up here, I'm in Tucson right now, growing up in my own community here in Arizona, I also grew up in San Diego, another border town. And so no matter where we were, either if we were in San Diego or we were back home in Arizona, there was always a process of going across the border for shopping, grocery shopping, pastry shopping. I love to go to the panderias. Certainly getting my fix of sweetbreads. Also a shared holiday of All Souls Day, going to Mexico to purchase wreaths for the grave sites, to honor our relatives that have passed on. And I can think of those days in San Diego doing that very easily and sort of in a neighborly, friendly way. I think that's how our family approached this. Back in Arizona, growing up as a youngster, this had to have been in the early 80s, going to what we would call the gate. And the gate is along the US-Mexico border. In those days, it was a cattle guard, you drive over the cattle guard, and a barbed wire fence. And that was the border. And there was a road that, went through the gate. And when we were in the summer times, I can remember we would make special family trips to go down to the gate, because we could barter for things like cheese, a specific cheese that comes from Mexico that, kind of a barter and trade between maybe our baked bread or our baked tortillas, and trade for the cheese. And it would kind of be a family day, I guess. And we would spend time there and sort of tailgate and visit. And I just have very fond memories of making those trips as a youngster. So it's kind of, I don't have a real clear answer of how I became aware. I was aware that there were people from my tribe, Alaskan people, that lived on the side of Mexico. And to this day, there are villages and communities down there of Alaskan people that live south of the border. And so politically, I think a lot of leaders have done the work of recognizing the sovereignty of Alaskan members that live south of the border and the rights that they have as a result of being tribal members, regardless if they live south of the US-Mexico border. And so in some ways, I see this relationship with folks in Mexico and in my own community as sort of relational, as neighborly, um, as peaceful, I think. And so yeah, I just have so many thoughts about like this. It's because it plays into my identity and who I am and how I represent myself to the world. If I say I'm a tribal member, you know, I also want to be mindful of the folks that may not have had the same privileges just because of a line that was drawn across our community. But I've had a very long experience. It feels like a very long experience. I guess it's really not that long, but upwards of more than 2 decades addressing HIV prevention in tribal communities across the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii. I started out starting out my bachelor's in sociology at a school that doesn't exist, unfortunately. It was the College of Santa Fe in Santa Fe in New Mexico. I transferred and finished my bachelor's at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And that's actually where I got my first job in HIV, was at a Indian Health Service clinic in Santa Barbara. My first job out of college was to sort of manage this HIV prevention program with no experience, basically. And 21 years later, I'm still having the conversations around the importance of culture as it relates to prevention. That's discussions of culture as it relates to treatment. And more recently, now that I have just graduated with a PhD in social welfare from the University of Washington in Seattle, it's like, how does culture direct research versus having research and then adding culture to it? I really want to see culture driving research in a way to be respectful, in a way to be inclusive. And so that's really where my work is kind of laying at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for sharing part of your culture with us and that story. You kind of headed in the direction where we're going with the conversation. Dr. Maldonado Moore mentioned how experiences shaped her, and I think that applies to all of us. Our experiences shape who we are and kind of forms a definition of how we see our world. So this next question is a 3-part question. Dr. Moore, I'll start with you. What is your definition of an inclusive community? How is this definition demonstrated? And what are some similarities between the Latino and Indigenous communities that you have noticed?
This is what you call a stacked question.
Yes.
And I have to start on the basic level so that I get to answering most of what you're asking. So bear with me. We'll circle back around to the beginning of this whole conversation. I want to say that inclusivity is really about including all of the individuals within a community, whether it's a project, program, an activity, but it's also very closely tied to what is equity. And equity ensures that each person receives or is entitled to the same resources or services. In theory, inclusion and equity are related to each other. You can't have one without having the conversation about the other, whether it's with policies or in practices. However, this country has gone through decades of social injustice where peoples have not experienced inclusion or equity. And I use myself as an example. Attending school in South Tucson compared to attending school in the east side of Tucson or north side of Tucson was a completely different experience. And that I was in as I said, a working class, blue collar neighborhood, and the resources weren't as extensive. We didn't go on field trips all the time. We didn't have like hands-on learning modules within our school system. And that these types of inequities really cut across the conversations of diversity in this country, or the representational diversity in this country. At present, I serve as the chair of my university's Council on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I also serve as a commissioner for CSWE, Council on Social Work Education, the Commission on Diversity and Social and Economic Justice. So I have local, regional, and national experiences of what's going on in the world. And of course, now we're dealing with the Black Lives Matters movement. And I add that we should be looking at brown people's lives movement. They matter. African Americans' lives matter, Hispanic lives matter, Indigenous people's lives matter, women's lives matter. All lives matter. And this is really the cry of this country at this time, that there are inequities that are impacting our fabric, or the whole society at large. And because of this, I'm also very aware that with COVID, it's like cracked open the situation in this country. It's exposed these inequities at a greater extent and level. And it's just not educational inequities. We're now dealing with this historical trajectory of racism, of power and greed, and how they have contributed to limiting equity and inclusion in this country. So with COVID, these disparities have become more obvious in communities of color, on reservations, in rural areas, and that we wouldn't have to have these special councils and commissions if we didn't have inequity in this country. And this is what really it drives home to me. We're now dealing with this pandemic, and knowing that these communities of color are being impacted at higher levels than most others. People with resources, they may get COVID, they may prevent COVID, but they also have the resources to go to an isolated area, or they can purchase those services that will prevent them from getting exposed to COVID. But we're dealing now with school systems and what's happening with these rural and urban or rural and territory reservation areas that don't have the broad bandwidth to have internet, even in their communities, not alone mentioning what's going on with the lack of resources for them to have a laptop, a computer, whatever instrument that they need. So it really comes down to the issue of an inclusive community means we, all of us, are our brother's keepers. We, all of us, should have some responsibility, moral or ethical, to address the needs of most of our marginalized and oppressed communities and individuals in this country. Some of the similarities that I've noticed between the Hispanic and the indigenous communities and peoples are the very inequities that I've just described. And when it comes to health inequities, we share similar findings. And we know, like there's this Latino paradox. If you immigrate into this country within one generation, you've lost a lot of your health assets. We know that. But that's also true with what happened to American Indian people with the introduction of commodities. We were a healthy people and focused on what was available regionally for our diet and for exercise. But within 1 or 2 generations, we have now the highest diabetes rate among ethnic populations. We have high heart and cancer rates. And this is true for Hispanic populations as well. So we're dealing with these types of health-related issues. The other similarities that I've been aware of is that language is being lost, and I call this linguicide. That as I shared with you earlier, that by the time I was in the first grade, I'm getting told by a first grade teacher that you don't be speaking Spanish in this classroom. And by then, my father used to teach us Spanish. I understood a lot of what he was saying. And knowing that if I'm not allowed to use terms that I'm familiar with, that means that I'll get in trouble if I speak any Spanish. So this language loss has been increasing with each generation. Some tribes like the Pueblos, the Hopis, the Diné, have managed to hold on to their language base, primarily because they live in isolated areas. But what about all of these other tribes and individuals who have become less fluent and more urbanized? And you know, the statistics are now showing that maybe 30, 40 years ago, 40% of American Indians were moving off the reservation and living in urban areas. Now it's as high as 70% of all American Indians are now living in urban or rural areas off of reservations and territories, which means that they don't have that connection to language. There are very few elders now who are speaking the language. And, you know, we have these immersion programs in schools, in tribal schools, reservation schools. But that doesn't mean that they are fluent and that they will be able to transmit that language over time. Uh, the other similarities that I've noticed is that between both cultures, some of the traditional beliefs are similar, like believing that there are imbalances and that these imbalances can be organic, but they can also be spiritual or cultural. And that is like introducing envidia. We know what it's like to be jealous or have envy against somebody else, and it's projected onto somebody so that that individual ends up getting ill from this experience. Or we know that there are curses in the world, and that there are some individuals who practice the dark side of what is intended to be traditions or spiritual practices. And from a strengths perspective, I've noticed that both cultures have a very strong sense of community, of family relationships, of appreciating art, of music, especially food, because food seems to be like one of the last threads that holds us to our culture of origin. And I've also become aware that there are multiple ways of healing. If we're treating a person, we're not only treating them physically, we're treating them mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, so that there's this holistic perspective of what it is that they're going through, and that we are reciprocating in this human relationship. And I'm actually of the belief that we are all spiritual beings, and that we are all here on this journey to return back to Creator. But this is our test on earth. How are you going to do it? And what tools do you need in order to accomplish this? So all of these different like cultural artifacts and exchanges are helping us in this spiritual progress, this transformation, until we return to our Creator. So some of these traditions, which I'll talk about in a little bit, they manifest in different ways. So we're hoping that through healing, and healing involves like tears, it can involve laughter, it involves meditation, prayer, loving relationships. So what I've also noticed is that because I had the benefit of a mother who was Northern Arapaho and Lakota, that's where the spoon hunter name comes from, so that I had the opportunity to practice the Red Road. I'm very aware of the like the 7 sacred rites or ceremonies of the Red Road. At the same time, because my father was very involved with the healing practices of Mexico, I got the best of both worlds.
Thank you, Dr. Moore, for sharing that. Dr. Ignacio, do you have anything to add?
It's just, yeah, thank you for that comment about community. That's really where my brain generally lives, is in terms of thinking around community. And that is I use that term very widely and broadly. So I'm thinking of doing outreach when I would be, doing HIV prevention outreach, living in, I don't know, it could be New York City. When I lived in New York City, working for an organization called Gay Men's Health Crisis, part of the job is condom distribution, setting condoms out in local bars and areas where people can access them to increase access to free condoms. And it didn't matter, I wanted to be sure that other communities other than the communities that I identified with were outreach to, but I also wanted to reach out to all other, how would you say, organizations of color. I believe that's even the term that they used at the time. But that it was intentional to reach out to organizations that were promoting social justice for people of color, because that's where the need is, right? To support one another in this work. And that even was more present as a doctoral student when I started my PhD program in 2015. That was in around the time of the beginning of the current administration. It was the lead up, the campaigning, and me starting this social work PhD program with like-minded students who were both people of color and non-people of color. And we're committed to social justice and sort of could see the writing of the wall of where the next handful of years was going to take us. And we're living through that scary time right now. But what I can say is, similarly to doing outreach and intentionally targeting other organizations of color, Hispanic, Latino organizations, and trying to help create access to condoms across New York City, similarly in this PhD program in Seattle, what ended up happening across campus was all the graduate students of color kind of came together to support each other in what we were witnessing right before our very eyes, which was destruction, right, with the elected person in the office who's currently there. We banded together and we supported each other. That was students who were friends of mine who were DACA recipients, folks who were immigrants from Africa were also banding together. Certainly, this was also the year when my first year started that Trayvon Martin in Florida was murdered, and the beginning of Black Lives Matter. And we banded together, and we actually were very critical of our own program, the School of Social Work, who wouldn't step up in a way that we felt was right. We banded together as students of color and other minority identified students to make those changes so that why shouldn't the School of Social Work be leading the Black Lives Matter across universities? And we're the ones that are social justice advocates. And so it's really that family, that relationship, that community. And I don't know, I just love making friends and having as many friends as possible. So it's also the socializing and the parties and, hanging out and dancing the salsa and bachata, and cumbias. I have many friends, that like to have a good time. And so I will never turn down an invitation to have a good time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ignacio. This is such a wonderful, rich conversation, and I have a little bit of bad news. We're over half of our time already, and we're on question 2. So I don't think we're gonna get through the questions that we planned for. So I'm gonna ask the next one, and then Dara is gonna start going to some of the Q&A. So if you have a chance to start browsing through the Q&A, and then we'll come back to a couple of the ones that we had planned because they're very significant and I do want to address them. But Dr. Ignacio, let's talk a little bit about navigating or continuing about navigating both communities. Can you provide some example of when you were able to navigate between both communities? And if you had the opportunity to give some advice to someone that's coming into the prevention field that wants to work with American Indian or Latinx communities, what can they do to prepare in order to make their penetration into these communities a little easier or a little better?
Yeah, sure. I have two words come to mind. The first is this healing, and the second word is land. And so I was very fortunate to teach a class at the University of Washington School of Social Work called Historical Trauma and Healing. I got to sole instruct it for 2 years while I was there as a student. And we talk about historical trauma, right? But we also talk about healing. And the way I broke it down to the students was like, this class is really like 40% trauma. We'll talk about the doom and gloom, but we also really want to center our conversations around healing. That, you know, we can talk about the traumas till we're blue in the face, but how are communities healing? Because we've been doing this all along. We've, you know, hundreds and thousands of years, we are survivors, we are resilient. So we really want to center the conversation around healing. And that was one way that I was able to engage Hispanic Latino students in this discussion around historical trauma as it pertains to the United States. Because slowly but surely, it was like unpacking layers of like, oh, colonialism just didn't happen in the United States, it also happened in Mexico. And so students who were newer to this understanding that's just the supremacy around who's human, who's not, and the role that religion and religious indoctrination played among Native people. Where am I going with this? So the healing. The healing is essential because I think that's where the conversation is been headed, and we're now here. We're now here to talk openly about our own individual healing practices. Some of us have been talking about this for a long time, but I feel like now in this country, we're at a national discussion around healing, and that's where I engage folks. Where I would suggest or where I would offer folks to begin this work, or maybe where they could lend a hand because it's critically needed, is around land, think about climate change, and think around the extraction of natural resources in South America, in North America. And there are grassroots organizations that are trying to address oil consumption and oil production and pipelines. You think of indigenous people in the Amazon, you think of the Zapatista movement, you think of where the help is needed. And that's kind of where I would maybe suggest folks might want to lend a hand.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Maldonado Moore, would you have a couple of examples for us as well? You're muted.
I have to agree with what Dr. Ignacio was saying about the land and paying attention to this. We actually live on a very fragile planet, and that we haven't been taking care of it very well. And knowing that we are all related, and the water is the issue. And look at what's happened with NODAPL. Now, that Dakota Access Pipeline did not affect one community. It infected thousands of miles of communities. And that movement really was essential for people to start waking up. It's about the water. It's about what goes into the water, how we drink the water, how our bodies process the water. It's all related. We are all related, and we should be more responsive in that respect. Something else that is part of this conversation, and I say this because I'm very much involved in social justice movements. Each institution really has to begin acknowledging how they landed where they are at this point in time. In higher ed, we talk about crafting land acknowledgement statements, which are a recognition that the lands that we are on now were appropriated. And it was a genocidal act that removed all of these different nations and allowed the Western movement to continue to change the way that the world is now operated under. I would also say that because of my own personal healing experiences, I had the opportunity to see things that probably other people haven't. People might say, oh, that's all smoke and mirrors or hocus pocus. Well, I have a testimony that if you believe in these traditional practices and that they can accomplish miracles, so you have to have that faith built into your own personal like DNA, knowing that if I participate, say, in a sweat lodge, I'm purifying myself, I'm preparing myself for something else like a vision quest, or if I'm going to participate in Sundance. Now, keep in mind that even the Sundance movement is very, very different across the nation. It's a Plains Indian practice, it's a ceremony, but not all Plains Indians practice the same sun dance. And I have the benefit, Dara has the benefit of knowing that my tribe is the only one in this country that is a community-based sun dance, and that there are no small sun dances that are generated by different family members. So this heals the entire family, it heals the community. We pray not just for individuals and families and communities, we pray for this country. We pray for the world, for the water, for the universe, in order for there to maintain balance in what's going on. Now, some of the other things that I've become very aware of through experience in life, and then having been asked to participate in this, as I said, I was going through this mental checklist. And for some of you who know this, some of these home remedies are just like ghastly. My father used to make this concoction of like lemons and onions and garlic and something else, and we were told to drink it, you know, every day. So this was like, here, have a spoonful of this, you'll stay healthy all the time. So we would do that. But the whole point is that that was an attempt to prevent illness, right? And if these cultural traditions helped us in the prevention of illness, and I can say that from my Indian world and from my Mexican world, I'm a pretty healthy person. And I attribute that to what I had experienced all through my life. So this whole seminar series, we're hoping to generate larger conversations, right? And what we've done also is we've compiled a list of resources for non-Indians, for non-Latinos, to begin to explore. This is about self-discovery. You're wanting to investigate what's the best way for you to engage with people who are different than yourselves. And I definitely highly recommend that you continue with humility. That means respect for other people, that you will continue to research your own self, be critically self-reflective, do the research, get to know people, build relationships, and work towards your own health. Because if you're not taking care of yourself, how can you take care of other people? And that's pretty much all I have to say about that.
So Dr. Mancini, I'm not sure how much other questions you're going to get to, but I think she was leading to question 5, if you wanted to go ahead and ask that one about self-care or, and.
Well, I thought you may, we may want to tackle a couple of the Q&As. Maybe the first one, or someone answer the first one.
Actually, I think there's the second and third one kind of go together. Okay. So we'll start with Dr. Ignacio. With regard to culture being a preventative measure in communities where worlds collide, how do you work with individuals who are pursuing a cultural identity to belong to, but have parents who do not encourage their identity to be something that defines them in the white world? And also to tag along with that, do you think that people who are losing their identity from the heritage that they are a part of, do you think that this has been hurtful to our society?
Oh, wow, that's a huge question. I may need your help with that one. Individuals who may feel ashamed for their identity and and parents or guardians are not supportive of that. I mean, those are conversations I very often have with in my HIV prevention days with folks who are LGBTQ two-spirit and may not have been accepted by their folks or the larger community. What I would say to anybody who's trying to, Dr. Moore is talking about, that this is an invitation for self-exploration, This is an invitation to explore your identity and affirm your identity and become grounded so that you can be able to be the provider that you want to be, the helper that you want to be. It really is about finding community, and maybe you can't find a community that's like-minded individuals where you are located. But I think that's kind of really the base. It's that relational element that is needed to find folks who are like-minded, who support you, who affirm you, who love you. And that's where you really want to spend your time is in those sorts of, in that company and those environments. I think that's just, you know, and attending forums such as this is another opportunity to come and learn and to share in dialogue and to grow with one another and learning. So that's kind of where my answer is around where do you go? The second part of the question was, refresh my memory.
Do you think people are losing their identity from the heritage that they are a part of? And has this been hurtful to our society?
Well, you know, if anybody who doesn't have access to living a life where they can be fully who they are is challenging. That's right. That's a definition of oppression. And so we don't want to create systems or societies where people can't fully be themselves or feel scared to be themselves or feel scared to walk down the street. When we have that fear, that's something we need to address and we need to look at and give it. And that's, I think, where we are today. We're having these very open, honest discussions around race, around identity, around safety, even just our own psychological safety. So do I, if you're not able to express yourself, do I think that's a problem? Yeah, I think it can cause a lot of issues such as substance use, such as denial, such as poor outcomes in health. I mean, it can lead to all of that. And so, yeah, that's a really odd answer to a question, but maybe Dr. Moore has more she wants to add.
Dr. Moore, would you like to add any to that?
As I was listening to Dr. Ignacio, it really goes back to that support system. As a child, as well as becoming an adolescent and knowing that you have this supportive, loving environment around you that's going to help you to grow. And as an adult, I think that mentoring from other people also helps significantly. And from my own experience, I have been mentored. I have one mentor still, and he is in his 80s, that I've had in my life since the early 1980s. So this mentor has like expanded my worldview and allowed me to grow in ways that otherwise I wouldn't have had that experience. And personal development, it takes a lifetime. I'm still growing. I'm still evolving. And even though, my hair is white, I still am in search of more learning and wanting to explore the world. So some of the tools that I've been very aware of, and this also leads into self-care, is recognizing when you need help, when you are struggling with your identity or an issue that you can't manage at this time. Now, the part of the question that Dara asked was, can this, if we are not in balance with our lives, can it impact our heritage? Yes. And the perfect example is the Indian Child Welfare Act. Had it not been for that act, thousands and thousands of children would have become assimilated, not acculturated. And that assimilation process was a mechanism by taking children through basically forced adoptions, removing Indian kids from their home environments and putting them in an environment that was totally foreign, but forced them to become assimilated, and they lost touch with who they were as Native people. Now, thank goodness, because of the policies that are in place now, that there's a mechanism in place where the tribes have more control over the development of children within the community, and knowing that their identity will be intact, that they will have a frame of reference for culture.
I think those were great answers to questions that were just thrown at you. We also have one more. So we often have our community members live and attend school in communities that know little to nothing about our culture. How can we help people not from our culture open their mind to learning about our culture and overcoming their own biases to be supportive of our children, individuals, and families? We'll start with you, Dr. Moore.
Can you repeat that, Dara?
It was a really long one.
Yeah.
It's under answered there.
Yeah, I see that one now.
Okay.
It's under answered.
Yeah, we often have our community members live and attend school in communities that know little to nothing about our culture. So how can we help people not from our culture open their minds to learning about our culture and overcoming their biases to be more supportive of our children?
Okay, let me start with an example from academia. You know that when faculty are hired to teach in higher education, there's a search committee, and the committee's assembled, and all of these individuals are looking for the perfect fit, the one person who's going to come in and help the department. But in most cases, the people on the search committee are looking for a replication of their own. They want somebody who's going to continue in the way that they have taught, you know. And both Dara and Dr. Ignacio know this. If you're mentored by an individual who is very progressive, you will become progressive. You will become a progressive teacher. If you're mentored by somebody who wants to replicate themselves, that's how you're going to teach. And I would say the same thing in a public school setting, is that the community themselves are trying to replicate themselves, and they want to maintain status quo. So that means that they are not open to really bringing in diversity where it impacts the kids. The whole goal of public education is to improve the quality of life of children so that they become better citizens of the country. Now, to bring community members along, that means that there have to be some progressive-minded individuals who recognize and respect the differences among people and want their children to be exposed to diverse perspectives and experiences. And the only way that's going to happen is if you get a handful of people who have like this passion, they have this vision, and that they want to change the system. And this social change movement obviously takes time because people keep replicating themselves, and the resources that can be brought in. It's a whole new world now with technology. There's no excuse anymore for limited books or used classroom materials. How progressive, how creative, how willing is a teacher to bring in new resources, and for the administration to bring in new people, new resources, and for the community to get behind this, because diversity programs don't impact one group of people, it impacts everybody. It improves the life of everybody, not just one set of students.
Dr. Ignacio, do you have anything to add?
That it's, of teaching, or I don't know how the question is, how do you get folks who are not from, say, a native culture more interested and more engaged and more supportive and wanting to learn about? We did you guys have a chance to talk about culture humility at all? I was kind of in and out. My internet has been a little acting funny today, and so I apologize. But we can talk about culture humility and really kind of having discussions with young folks around what is culture humility. And in a nutshell, that is really embracing this identity of being a lifelong learner, that I could never be truly competent in someone else's culture. So that term cultural competency really doesn't make sense. It's impossible to become competent in someone else's culture. But I can be humble, and I can come from a perspective of humility towards your culture. And when we teach young folks, these lessons, these values of interdependence and of relationship and of community, that's where the work is, I believe. At least we're a good starting place.
Thank you so much, both of you. Those are fantastic. Let me see if we can get at least one more of some of these other questions that we had discussed. And Dr. Ignacio, let me start with you. Do you have an example of when you realized you had to focus on your own self-care? What did it consist of, and how did you rely on, or were you able to incorporate your culture during that process? In other words, how did you shape your definition of self-care, and what would you recommend to others in the field?
Well, I'm currently right now in a sort of a phase 2.0 of self-care. Across my life, I was able to listen to some of the other presentations prior to this session, the sessions 1 through 3. And, I was baptized in the Catholic Church, and I was also raised with traditional approaches to healing and medicine and spirituality. So I have both. And I've always, my father, before he passed away at 64, I believe was on this path to becoming a traditional healer. He was already practicing traditional medicine in the home and among other relatives. And so I was raised with, that going on in our home. And I was also raised with church. So in other words, spirituality was always something I was taught to rely on when times got tough. Well, fast forward, and life has been challenging for me as it has been for a lot of folks and for others as well. Being Native and some of the stuff that comes with family and alcoholism and diabetes and death and grief and all of that. I'm certainly no stranger to that at all. So I've always kind of had this background spiritual hotline I could tap into. Well, fast forward into the PhD program when I started it in 2015, I was really unprepared for what I was about to encounter. And it wasn't the schoolwork. It wasn't the statistics. It wasn't the classwork. It wasn't the homework. That wasn't the challenge over 5 years. The challenge was being in an environment that was hostile to people who looked like me, who had skin color like me. That was what I was unprepared for. In addition to statistics and the coursework and the lectures and the need to focus and be able to read after having been out of school for 7 years. And it was a traumatic experience. My first year in the program was a traumatic experience. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about that first year, but I ended up developing rheumatoid arthritis just as the summer began, beginning of my second year, an inflammatory disease. And I knew something had to happen. I knew that what I was doing in terms of prayer and the sort of spiritual hotline that I could tap into wasn't going to be enough to be able to get me through the next 4 years to walk across the stage with my PhD. I just knew something had to change. And so it took an event. It took a traumatic event for me to up my game when it came to self-care. And self-care starts squarely with spirituality. Prayer became much more ritualized. And I didn't just pray once, I prayed throughout the day, right? I started my mornings because I couldn't sleep past 4 or 4:30 in the morning. I just started using that time to learn how to meditate, and I invested in a phone app called Headspace. And you'd be surprised what 10 minutes of meditation once a day can do over a period of time. And then again, surrounding myself, I can think of one good friend I had in the program. She was from the Menominee Nation, Dr. Angela Fernandez. She was 2 years ahead of me at the program, also very spiritual. Just having scheduled, like maybe we couldn't get together, but maybe once every 2 months. That's how busy we both were. But dedicating time to meet with her just to have talks about self-care, spirituality, and to share notes and what's working for us. And that lasted all the way until she graduated the year before I did. So it definitely took an event for me to wake up again and to retool some of my self-care approaches.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You know, sometimes it's important for us to revisit how we're taking care of ourselves and make that adjustment and that midterm correction, if we will. Dr. Moore, how about you? How did you take care of yourself? How has your culture helped you do that?
As I said before, spirituality is related to health, and health is related to spirituality, healing, and that a person knows when they're out of balance. You're intuitively realize that something's not quite right. And that's really how it usually begins with me. Now, I've participated in a lot of community ceremonies, as I've mentioned before, through the Lakota Red Road. And I've also participated in individual ceremonies and healings. And keep in mind that every tribe has their own way, and that within their tribe, then the medicine people have their own ways. So they like have specializations. And it just depends on what's going on when I recognize, hey, something's not right, and I've got to address this particular issue. Now, when I know that I'm out of balance, I know I have to ask for help. Nobody's going to read my mind and recognize this. You know, I'm the one that's got to like step up and say, I have an issue or a problem. This is what's going on. I need help. Who can I go see? And it's really a referral system. If I were to talk to my grandmother, who's deceased, but I would have talked to her, she would tell me, oh, you know, you need to go see this person. And sometimes there are female healers that do a better job in their special area compared with males who do a better job in their special area. So I ask for help. And if there's a ceremony involved, I have to prepare for it. I'm the one that has to fast and pray and make sure that my mind is right when I'm going into this experience. And that means preparations for myself, preparations for a meal, preparations for the people who are doing the healing. And this also means that during the ceremony, I have to be present. I can't be wandering off in my mind and, you know, doing all of these like mental gymnastics about what's going on. I have to be very focused and disciplined and listening. And this also means following the instructions that they give me. If they tell me to do something to the letter, you better do it to the letter, knowing that there's a purpose for this. And it's true that there's a Christian concept that what happens in the spirit world also happens in the physical world, or what happens in the physical world also happens in the spiritual world. And so what we're trying to do is through this figure 8 loop, in that apex is where we're trying to find and restore that balance that is gone. And we're in that search. So following instructions is very, very important. And gradually there is a process of restoration or healing that occurs. It's a gradual process. And many people think that if they go through a ceremony, bam, overnight, you know, they're cured, or that it's okay. No, it's a process of continual self-reflection, following the instructions, being in tune, and knowing that, having faith that you're going to get through this, and that there are a lot of people up above and on earth who are helping you get through this process.
That was a great answer. So as we are coming up to the close of this discussion, I'd like to ask each of you to wrap up this conversation in about a 2 to 3 minute answer. So how would you wrap up the topic of navigating between these two communities? or any closing thoughts that you have about that.
I'll just make this very brief. And we just barely touched on this, and I think that we have to pursue this at some point. There is a difference between cultural competency and cultural humility. And I would highly recommend that individuals who are in the audience who are aware of this difference, that you practice this. You pay attention to who you are as a human being, be respectful of others, and work towards the greater good. That's why we're here. We're not here just for ourselves. We want to be able to improve society. And hopefully this type of webinar has opened a conversation where individuals can start looking at themselves, resources, and future projects that will be bridges between and amongst each other. And I want to say thank you. Thank you for hosting this series and allowing me to participate. Thank you.
No, thank you for being here and giving us and sharing us your thoughts. And I believe we lost Dr. Ignacio again.
I believe we did. Thank you so much, Dara. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. And thanks to all of the individuals that spend this time with us. I did want to share a couple of things. There were some comments in the chat, and for Dr. Ignacio, this is being recorded, so I want to go on record. There were some people from his tribe that were saying hello in the chat, and they were happy to be here and wanted to make sure that he knew that there were also members of his tribe that were listening to him today. For Dr. Moore, there is some people that want to take you traveling across the United States to take your message to younger people and to old people. So I think there's you have many fans in this audience. And some also commented to the beautiful painting behind you of what a powerful picture it is, what a powerful picture it is. So I wanted to share those thoughts with you. So as we said, coming to the conclusion of this before we turn it over to Dolka and Cindy for closing, I want to say thank you, Dr. Maldonado Moore. Thank you to Dr. Ignacio for sharing parts of yourselves with us today. Dara, thank you so much for co-hosting this with us and with me. It's been a privilege to be here with you. And Dolka and Cindy, thank you so much for a wonderful 4-session virtual learning series. It has been an honor and a pleasure to be here, and congratulations. I think it's been a magnificent series. And I'll turn it back to you, Dolka, for closing. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Dara, Dr. Mancini, Dr. Rebecca, and Dr. Ignacio, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much to all the participants for those beautiful comments and recommendations, for sharing all the materials in the chat. It was amazing. So thank you so much. Here you are seeing the contact information from our center. So please free to reach to us. If you need, we can share with you some of the resources. Next slide, please. So also you can see the presenters' contact information in case we didn't have the opportunity to answer all your questions. Then some of the free resources that you can go and visit later on. This is just like for our panelists. So thank you again, Dr. Rebecca Moore and Dr. Ignacio. And you feel free, please, to visit all those resources and to learn more about this important topic. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next. And again, we want to thank you for participate in this amazing virtual learning session. Thank you so much for the American Indian Alaskan Center to collaborate with us and deliver these sessions. Here again, this is, if we were not able to answer all the questions, so don't hesitate to contact us. our center is really grateful for all the support that we received during those sessions. Now we're going to ask Dr. Ignacio if he is back. I don't know, let me see. I think we lost Dr. Ignacio. He's not with us, but he prepared a beautiful closing blessing for this part. But now we're going to move to our evaluation. So next slide. So please, everyone, from now on, everyone will be redirected to complete the evaluation. This is a very important process for us. It really helps us just to have your opinion to get a better service next time. And again, once again, thank you for joining us during this event. Culture is prevention. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.